Colorado, Rockies. Winter of 1830, the wind came first, sharp as broken glass, tumbling down the Elk Range with sound like distant artillery rolling through stone canyons. Snow whirled in tight spirals, scraping across the frozen earth, piling against the log cabins of the Beaver Bend trapping camp. It was the kind of cold that hit straight through wool and buckskin, the kind of cold old trapper said could freeze the inside of man's lungs if he breathed. Too deep at the edge of the clearing stood small, low-roofed cabin, half buried in the drifts. What made it unsettling wasn't its shape or the strange slant of its outer wall log, for that alone was odd enough. It was the chimney, or rather, the chimney that wasn't smoking 3 days without curl of wood smoke. To the men of Beaver Bend, that meant only one thing. He's gone, someone muttered, pulling his buffalo robe tighter. No man lives through this without fire. Lantern bobbed through the dark as the group of trappers shuffled toward the silent cabin. Their breath billowed in thick white plumes, freezing in their beards. A pair of dogs whined, picking up something in the wind.
Blast it!
Fear, maybe, or uncertainty. At the front of the group walked Caleb Bunyan, the oldest trapper in camp, thick-shouldered, gray-bearded, stubborn as mule. He spat into the snow. A Crow was good fellow, he said quietly, but fool. Everyone saw it, building walls like burrowing in 'em, digging holes around the foundation, packing moss like he was stuffing mattress. Ain't no sense to it. Donner paused, looking once more at the chimney, still cold, silent as stone. Let's get him out of there, he said. Or what's left to bury. They unlatched the door, snow cracking around the hinges, and push it open with groan. What they feel first isn't shock, it's warmth. Soft, dry, unbelievable wave of warmth. Not summer warmth, no. But warm enough that their faces sting from the sudden change, warm enough that one man blurts out, "What in the devil?" And then they see him. Elias Crowe, sitting cross-legged on the floor, calmly stitching the sole of worn moccasin by lamplight, steam rising from small tin cup beside him, wearing nothing but wool shirt. Not shivering, not blue-faced, entirely impossibly alive. He looks up slowly like they've interrupted nothing more serious than a quiet evening. "Morning, Caleb," Crowe says softly. Door sticks bit in this weather. Donner stares at him, at the cabin, at the seem impossibly warm.
It wasn't
to
the fire
the
that
touch
kept me
Crowe.
alive.
He whispers, "There's no fire.
The
Your
walls
heart's stone
did."
cold." Elias Crowe sets down his needle, folds his hands, and says the words that begin our story. "I don't keep the fire alive, Caleb. The walls keep me alive." Before that winter made his name a quiet legend, Elias Crowe had been nobody. Not famed guide, not celebrated scout, not the kind of man whose stories drifted down saloons or trading posts. He was simply Elias. Soft-spoken, narrow-shouldered, thoughtful to the point some men called him bookish, which was nearly an insult in the Rockies. Born in 1805 in New Hampshire, Elias grew up among kilns, clay pits, and stacks of hand-molded brick. His father was brickmaker, craftsman who believed that good walls, whether of brick, clay, or timber, were more than shelter. They were man's boundary against winter, misfortune, and time itself. Elias learned early how heat moved through things. He learned how clay breathed, how it cracked, how it held warmth long after the fire died. He learned the smell of pine pitch softening over coals, the texture of wet earth that would later harden into tiles strong enough to hold generations. But New England changed. By the mid-1830s, the markets were shifting. Big towns were buying machine-pressed brick, and small craftsmen like the Crows found themselves squeezed out. Elias never married, restless at 30, sold what tools he could, and joined wagon headed west. He reached the Rockies in the fall of 1836, carrying little more than a hatchet, brace of chisels, and mind trained to watch how materials behaved to seasoned trappers of Beaver Bend. He was an oddity, man who listened more than he spoke, who studied frost patterns on bark, who held handful of mountain clay with the same attention others reserved for maps.
Fires
The
or
mountains
cutting more
hardened him.
logs.
Cold will do
It's
that.
heat loss,
But they never rubbed
insulation,
out the
and
craftsman
endurance.
inside him. Where other men saw trees, he saw grain and density. Where they saw dirt, he saw potential walls. Where they saw a cabin as a box to sleep in, Elias saw a chance to build a shelter that didn't just block winter, but resisted it. He wasn't famous, he wasn't rugged, he wasn't even particularly strong, but he understood something most frontier men ignored. Heat isn't just made, heat can be kept. And that quiet idea, born in Brickshed in New Hampshire, was about to turn one lonely cabin into the warmest place in the entire valley. The winters of the late 1830s were cruel teachers in the high Rockies, and no lesson was harsher than the one delivered at Beaver Bend. The valley was beautiful in summer. Blue gentian tall grass outcrossing the meadows like drifting shadows. But once November came, all softness vanished. The cold didn't simply settle over the land. It conquered it. Cabins the trappers built followed one pattern. Single log walls, hurried chinking big hearth, and piles of firewoods. High they could be seen from the ridge. It was the accepted way, the only way. Men judged each other by how fast they could fell trees and how long they could keep fire roaring. When Elias Crowe arrived and watched them build, he noticed the same mistakes repeated everywhere. Gaps between logs wide enough to whistle through, chimneys leaking heat like sieves, frosted corners where drafts pulled like invisible predators. But when he offered suggestions,
he thinks he's gonna build something big.
Men laughed. You want
He's
warm
just gonna
walls,
freeze
Crowe?
out here.
Caleb Donner barked once. Burn more wood. That's the whole trick. That was the philosophy at Beaver Bend. If you're cold, you didn't cut enough trees. No one questioned it. No one challenged it, least of all during those first 2 winters. Elias lived there when he quietly
Why would anyone build
small
2 cabins
lean-to
in
and
one?
watched how the old hands fought the cold, chopping wood until their hands blistered, waking every 2 hours to feed the fire, sleeping in layers of hides that smell. Spoken pine pitch. By the autumn of 1838, Elias had seen enough. He picked clearing near the slope, away from the other cabins. Instead of stacking logs, he dug shallow trench. Instead of rushing to roof the frame, he spent days gathering moss, drying grass, and scraping charcoal dust from burn stumps. The work confused everyone. No trapper understood why. A man would pack rucksacks full of root newly or kneel in the mud mixing clay when the nights were already dropping below freezing. Caleb Donner watched the longest, leaning on his axe, shaking his head. "To building burrow, not cabin," he said. "I can't say I've ever seen man dig his uphill into winter." The others laughed. Elias didn't. He simply kept working. Quiet, deliberate, shaping materials the way potter shapes vessel. Word spread around camp. Crowe wasn't right in the head. Crowe was wasting time. Crowe would freeze by Christmas. But Elias ignored them, because he had a different measure of safety, a different way of understanding warmth. Where others saw winter as an enemy to be held back by brute force, Elias saw it as pressure to prepare for. Problem of flow, loss, and resistance, and that lonely patch of snow and mud, he began building the only cabin in Beaver Bend, designed from the ground up to fight cold itself, not just overpower it with fire. It didn't look like much. Low walls, odd angles, layers of material no mountain man had ever used. But the shape of his idea was already forming, and soon it would make all their roaring fires look small. When Elias finally began raising the walls, the men of Beaver Bend stopped mocking him long enough to stare. Whatever he was building, it wasn't log cabin as they knew it. The footprint was narrow, the roof line low, and the wall faces leaned ever so slightly. An odd, slanted posture that made this structure look more like an animal hunkering down against the wind than a home for man. He worked in silence, rarely looking up, shaping every piece with patience nobody else in camp had time for. Instead of stacking logs right away, Elias started with the strange materials he'd spent all autumn gathering. From the clay pits near the creek, he had cut thick blocks of earth, mixed them with pine pitch, and pressed them into wooden molds. These tiles, rough, uneven, sun-dried slabs, lay in rows outside his cabin site like mismatched stepping stones. More than one trapper walked by, shook his head, and muttered, "A fellow's trying to build sideways." But Elias wasn't building chimney. He was building the center layer of wall system no one in those mountains had ever imagined. It began with the first layer, what looked like bundles of dark furry mats, moss grass, charcoal dust, all beaten and pressed into thin pads. The smell of earth and burned wood clung to them. He set these into the rising frame like craftsman setting felt into the lining of trunk. Caleb Donner trudged by during one of his steps, axe over his shoulder. "What in the name of common sense is that?" he asked. "Breath layer," Elias answered, packing another pad into place. "Keeps the cabin from losing its lungs." Caleb snorted. "Cabins don't breathe, Crowe." "They do," Elias murmured. "Most just breathe too fast to stay warm." The second layer came next. The heavy mud tiles, Elias pressed them between the timber ribs with careful pressure, sealing edges with thin beads of pine pitch. Each plate fit tight like puzzle piece forged from mountain earth. When struck
Either Crowe is dead,
made low, dense thud. They would warm slowly, cool slowly.
or he discovered something the rest of us missed.
The third layer, the outermost, was the strangest. Instead of placing logs horizontally, Crowe leaned slimmer logs at slight outward angle like overlapping shingles. It was shaped that confused every man who saw it. Slanted walls were weak, they claimed. Dueless. Foolish. Caleb Donner looked at the angle, squinted. He said, "You're laying logs like Beaver's Dam." "And that's the idea," Elias replied. Let the wind slip past, make it hard for cold to claw its way in. For every hour other trappers spent cutting firewood, Elias spent 3 shaping, mixing, smoothing, aligning. His hands were stained black with charcoal and green with moss oils. Clay dust clung to his sleeves like frost.
Grunts.
He didn't speak unless spoken to.
Yawns.
Someone mocked him, which happened often. He didn't rise to it. He just kept working, patient as winter itself. By the end of October, most men had finished their cabins. Fires crackled in every chimney. Meat racks filled with drying strips of venison. Beaver pelts hung stiff on frames near the creek. Elias's cabin, meanwhile, had walls only halfway up. "You'll die in that mound of moss and mud," one trapper warned. Caleb Donner, the skeptical, wasn't cruel. He stepped close and laid calloused hand On the half-built wall, it felt heavy, solid, warmer than the air round it, even though no fire had touched it. Caleb frowned. Crow, he said softly, "Oh, how thick is this thing going to be when you're done?" "Oh, thick enough," Elias
How did you
answered.
sleep?
"Warm enough, but winter's
The
coming."
walls held.
"I know. And you're behind. I'm right on time." No one believed him. No one understood him. But as snow began to creep down the peaks, Elias Crowe, alone, quiet, covered in dust from the bones of the mountain, kept adding layer after careful layer. Cabin, unlike any other, rose slowly under his hands, and soon the snowstorms would put it to the test. As November bled into December, the valley changed. A wind sharpened, the sunlight thinned, and the world seemed to shrink into a palette of white and blue steel. Men who had mocked Elias just weeks earlier were now chopping wood in frantic shifts, racing the cold they knew was coming. They had seen winters like this before. They knew the signs. Elias Crowe did too.
It's useless.
But instead of hauling timber, he walked close circles around his cabin, checking seams, testing joints, tapping each section of wall like man tuning an instrument. The storm arrived on the night of December 17th, and not gentle snow, and not drifting curtain, but barricade, full assault of wind and ice that rattled the valley from ridge to ridge. Snow smashed against the cabins with such force that men had to shout to hear one another inside. Doors swelled with frost. Firewood vanished twice as fast as planned. Hinges groaned. Rafters shuddered. Inside the stair cabins, men huddled close enough to their fires to feel singed on one side and frozen on the other. Keep her fed, someone barked. More logs. Keep her alive. Every 2 hours, all night, someone woke to fight, pulled back with an armful of wood. But one cabin, the low slanted mud and moss thing down by the slope, stayed silent. No smoke, no flicker in the window, no sound of chopping, nothing. By dawn, the storm had eased just enough for 3 trappers to step outside and check on the living and the dead. Their boots broke through thick crusted ice. The wind hummed low, curling around their hoods. The crow's done for. Someone whispered, "No fire since yesterday." He froze stiff. "You watch." Caleb Donner didn't speak, but his jaw was taut. He respected Elias, even if he didn't understand him, and he didn't like the thought of man dying alone in half-mad cabin experiments. They trudged through waist-high drifts and reached the slanted outer wall. Frost clung to the logs like crushed diamonds. The door was buried foot deep. The hinges were iced fast. Caleb slammed his shoulder against it twice, 3 times. The door cracked inward with grunt of breaking frost. Warmth spilled out, not gust, no. That soft, steady glow of air that didn't belong to this world of ice. The trappers froze, not from cold, but from disbelief. Inside, the cabin hovered around, Fort Addicks, warmer than any leather-wrapped fire hugger in Beaver Bend. Their faces flushed instantly. Their breath thinned in the gentler air, and there sat Elias, cross-legged, calm, tin lamp flickering beside him, moccasin in his lap, needle threading through the sole with unhurried motion. He didn't flinch when they burst in. He just looked up as if they'd arrived for morning coffee. "Storm's easing," Elias said, voice quiet, steady. "You boys warm enough out there?" Caleb walked in, palm landing on the inner wall. His expression broke. The wall was warm, not lukewarm. Warm like stone that had held the sun all afternoon. "What in God's name?" Caleb whispered. "We ain't had fire all night. I haven't needed one." Elias replied. "Let the walls do their work." Lantern flame danced gently in the draftless room. No smoke, stale air, no frantic firewood pile. Just man, cabin, and heat that lingered long after the coals on the hearth had died to
nothing,
ash. Outside,
yet slept
every other
warm.
cabin fought for life. Inside Crows, the brutal Rockies
walls
might as
carried
well
the
have been
night.
miles away. And for the first time, the men of Beaver Bend began to understand. This wasn't madness, this wasn't luck, this was something else. Design that tame winter instead of fearing it. At first, the men crowded inside the doorway in stunned silence, letting the warmth press against their frozen faces. They weren't the sort
But
who
there's no
rattled
fire.
easy. These were men who'd crossed blizzards, outrun grizzlies, and slept under skies cold enough to crack rifle stocks. But this warm, fireless cabin in the middle of killing storm, shook them. Caleb Donner broke the silence. "Crow," he muttered, "your heart's dead. Your chimney's colder than a well rope." "How blazes is this room near 40 degrees? Elias didn't gloat.
The
He
heat
didn't
is
smile.
not from
He
the
simply
fire,
set aside his moccasin,
but
wiped
from the
clay dust
materials
from his
themselves.
fingers, and touched the wall beside him. Gently, the way Potter checks the temper of cooling vessel. "These aren't just walls," so he said. "They're part of the heat. Hold it, move it, feed it back." Caleb frowned, baffled. "Walls don't feed anything." "They do," Elias replied. "If you build them to." The trappers stepped farther in,
Trapped,
closing the storm
unmoving
behind.
air
Their boots
becomes
melted,
insulation.
little puddles of ice on the packed earth floor. One man placed both palms against the inner wall and jerked back as if it were alive. "That's warm," he whispered. "Warmer than my bunk, even with fire going." Elias nodded once. "You remember the layers," he said, speaking slowly so the men could follow. "You saw me making them all autumn." Caleb scoffed. We saw you stuffing moss and dirt into bags like madmen. Elias didn't disagree, just continued. First layer,
Stores the
moss,
fire and gives
grass,
it back
charcoal
through the night.
dust. Pressed in, it captures air but doesn't let it move. He tapped the wall with his knuckles. The sound was soft, dense. Still, air keeps heat better than any log. The trappers exchanged glances. They'd heard of insulation in passing, mostly from stories of far-off Easter houses stuffed with wool or flax, but none had believed it mattered. Fire was king. Everything else was nonsense.
Stops
Elias
air
continued.
from moving at
Second
all.
layer, the mud tiles.
Blocking
Clay and
convection
pine
entirely.
pitch. Clay drinks heat like sponge and lets it go slowly. That's why potters fire kilns. They trust clay to hold warmth long after the flames die. Caleb rubbed his beard so this wall remembers heat. That's one way to say it. Elias rose, walked to the section of wall nearest the hearth, and placed palm flat to demonstrate. When I burned fire yesterday morning, these tiles soaked up the heat.
How did you think this
Once
up?
the storm rolled in, the tiles started giving that heat back.
The mountains teach.
Slow, steady,
if you listen.
even. They don't cool fast. They never do. The men leaned forward as though listening to secret. And then Elias added, there are the tubes. So the what? Caleb blinked. Elias knelt by the wall and tapped narrow vertical line between the tiles. Clay tubes, small, hollow. They run from the floor up toward the rafters. When the cabin warms, air in the tubes rises. So slowly it barely counts as movement, but it spreads that warmth all the way up the wall. Makes the whole cabin act like single body of heat instead of box of cold corners. One of the younger trappers crouched beside him, eyes wide. You built chimneys inside your walls. He breathed, and not chimneys, Elias corrected. And channels, they don't vent heat. They share. Caleb stared at the slanted outer logs next to him and these walls who leaned outward. What's that for? When Elias said, straight wall tries to stop the wind.
Like the
Slanted one, what's the worst of it? Glide past, less pressure. Less heat pulled from the logs. The room fell quiet again. Outside, wind scraped and moaned against the valley. Snow hissed. Frost crawled across the windows. Yet inside, the heaterless cabin sat warm and unhurried, as if insulated not only from cold, but from the very idea of winter. Finally, Caleb spoke in low voice. So let me understand
this isn't
right.
fire.
Your cabin warms
This
itself.
is something else.
Because everything you put in these walls is fighting for the same purpose. Nodded once. Fire is only the beginning. He said, most men think you must keep the flame alive to stay alive. But heat doesn't vanish. It migrates, it leaks, it hides. And if you build wall that stops every path that tries to take it, then heat stays home. Younger trapper swallowed hard.
Most men
you're
fight the
telling us
cold
you
with
only
fire.
burn 2 hours in the morning, most
But
days,
fire
and the
burns
rest
out.
of the day. Elias shrugged lightly.
Walls don't.
The walls do their work. The trappers looked around. The warm air, the quiet lamp, the frostless corners, and for the first time, the men of Beaver Bend understood just how much they'd underestimated the quiet New Englander who mixed moss and mud like sacred ingredients. He wasn't fighting winter the way they did. He was out thinking. The storm ended 2 days later, leaving the valley buried under drifts taller than a man. Smoke rose from every chimney in Beaver Bend. Thick, frantic, desperate, the cold hadn't eased. It had merely paused, letting the men catch their breath before the next assault. Most trappers looked gaunt, eyes red from nights spent feeding their fires like starving livestock. But one cabin still stood quiet and warm. By now the story of Crow's miracle walls had spread camp like wildfire, warm, comforting wildfire. And men who would never admit weakness suddenly found excuses to wander past his door, check in. Curiosity, anything but the truth. They wanted to feel that impossible warmth again. Caleb Donner was the first to return. He knocked tentatively, as though Elias might refuse him. But the door opened with its usual gentle groan. Caleb, Elias said, nodding. How's your fire holding? The old trapper stepped inside and winced as warmth softened the ice in his bones. Fire's holding, he muttered, barely. Been burning near it nonstop. Used half my winter cut already. Elias poured him a cup of hot tea. Caleb accepted it silently. He sat long moments staring into the steam before speaking. I was wrong, he said abruptly. About your cabin, about your walls, about everything. Elias didn't smile, didn't preen, didn't act vindicated. He simply waited. Caleb's voice dropped rougher now. Crow, I've spent 40 winters in these mountains. Thought I knew the cold. Thought I knew what man needed to face it. Chop wood, burn it, stay alive. He shook his head slowly. But this room of yours, it chained every fire in Beaver Bend. He set his cup down, calloused fingers trembling slightly. Would you teach me? Caleb asked in the spring. Tell me how you built these walls, the whole thing, from the ground up. I don't want to freeze through another year like this. Elias considered him, studied the lines carved deep by cold and age, and nodded. Yes, I'll teach you. The next day, 3 more men came, and 5, and pair of brothers who were too proud to step inside but hovered at the door with hats in hand. Each carried the same mix of embarrassment. Each asked for the same thing. Crow, when the thaw comes, could you show me how? And Elias said yes every time. He didn't charge pelts or coin. He didn't demand favors. He didn't boast. He simply agreed as though he had been waiting for anyone, to ask, not with mockery, but with curiosity. Caleb, who began to visit more often, noticed something else. Elias didn't think of himself as an inventor. He thought of himself as student. One evening, as the two men repaired gear by lamplight, Caleb asked him, "Why'd you build your cabin like this, Crowe? Ain't never seen anything like it. Didn't think anyone had." Elias shrugged lightly. "I didn't invent warmth," he said. "I just paid attention to how it behaves."
This shouldn't be
That
possible.
humility, quiet, unforced, did more to win the camp over than the warm walls themselves. By the end of winter, the men who once called him crazy now respected him in the way frontier men reserve for hunters who never waste shot, trackers who never lose trail,
Heat flows
and
like
builders
water.
whose work doesn't need explaining.
Layers slow
Elias
it.
Crowe had survived the
Mass
worst storm
stores
of the
it.
decade with lifting an axe or nursing fire through the night. Not because he was stronger, not because he was luckier, but because he listened to heat and built home that refused to let it leave. When the thaw finally came and the rivers cracked open with spring melt, the men of Beaver Bend kept their word. They gathered around Elias Crowe's cabin with tools in hand. Axes, adzes, clay scrapers, were ready to watch, learn, and copy whatever they could. But they soon discovered something surprising. It wasn't that Elias refused to teach, it was that almost no one
winter
could
has
truly
barely
replicate
begun,
what he'd done. The first
our
problem
wood
was
stores are
patience.
already
Where
dwindling.
a typical frontier cabin took a week or two, Crowe's wall system consumed months. Every layer demanded curing, drying, packing, adjusting, work that didn't offer immediate reward. Most trappers, hardened by long seasons and tight schedules, simply didn't have the temperament for it. Caleb tried the hardest. He collected moss until his hands were green-stained for days. He gathered charcoal dust until the smell clung to his clothes. He mixed clay and pitch the way Elias showed him, slow, deliberate, waiting for the earth to tell him it was ready.
How
But
did you stay
even
warm
Caleb
with so
shook
little
his head
fire?
more than once. This
It's
ain't
about
cabin
layers,
building.
airflow,
He muttered,
and trapped
"This
heat."
is surgery." Others attempt the smaller versions. An extra moss panel here, a few mud tiles there. But without understanding the way Elias balanced insulation, mess, and airflow, their walls behaved more like heavy blankets than
The
living
walls
heat
store
reservoirs.
fire,
Few cabins did improve.
the way a
Yes, some
canteen
trappers
stores
reported
water.
warmer quarters. Others noticed their fires lasted longer into the night. But none reached the quiet, astonishing stability of Elias's home. Still, the idea spread. By summer's end, stories about the Crowe Wall traveled farther than the valley. A pair of Idaho trappers built crude kappas, double layers
take a
of
look
moss
at this.
and clay that kept their hunting shacks
wow.
noticeably warmer. A family in Wyoming, hearing rumors through a trading post, started using charcoal-dusted moss as chinking and swore to have their heat loss. But with each retelling, the details blurred, the layers simplified, the tubes were left out, the slanted logs straightened again. The technique lived, but only in fragments, and as the 1840s rolled on, even those fragments began to fade. Iron stoves became common. Sawmills brought milled lumber to the frontier. Settlements grew, offering new materials, new habits, new shortcuts. The old ways, hard ways, quietly slipped into the background.
Can it be taught?
By 1900, only a handful of homesteads still used slanted outer walls or charcoal moss mixtures. By 1910, the
taught?
last person who had learned directly from Elias Crowe passed away in Mountain Valley far west of Beaver Bend. When it finally collapsed under snow load decades later, the walls, thick as man's outstretched arm,
Look closely at the subtle
broke
cues.
open like the
The
cross-section
moisture
of forgotten
patterns,
machine,
temperature
moss still
gradients,
springy,
and the
clay
convection
tiles
paths.
still firm, the tubes still intact. Structure built not for season but for an era, and yet no one alive could explain why it worked. No one knew the name Crowe. The design became an oddity, then curiosity, then mystery. Piece of frontier ingenuity, quietly dissolved by time. But the truth lingered even if the technique did not. One man had outbuilt the cold with nothing but earth, mind, and patience, and almost no one managed to follow him. Modern builders like to think of themselves as pioneers of efficiency, inventors
So you
of
want to
new
make sure
methods,
it's square and
guardians
true.
of progress.
Right,
But the truth,
understood.
quiet, stubborn, and older than any textbook, sat in Elias Crowe's cabin long before anyone spoke the words building science. Crowe Wall wasn't just clever trick, it was philosophy, way of thinking that the frontier nearly forgot. Men in the Rockies believed warmth was made by fire alone. More wood, more flame, more sweat. But Crowe's cabin revealed something deeper. Warmth isn't created. It's preserved. That idea nearly lost with him.
Bring
Speaks
that
louder
end
today
around.
than it ever did
Easy
in
now.
1830.
Mind
As
the alignment.
homestead era gave way to towns, then towns gave way to cities. Building changed. People wanted things fast. They wanted boards cut by mills, nails forged by machines, walls built in days instead of seasons. Efficiency, yes, but of labor, not of energy. And so frontier shifted towards speed, not wisdom. Thin wall, straight logs, stoves doing all the work, heat escaping as quickly as it was made. But what Elias understood still applies to anyone who builds camps, homesteads, or simply wants
Holds
to
a day's
outsmart the
fire
cold.
like a
Insulation
stone.
keeps heat from
Holds
leaving.
sunlight.
Thermal mass keeps heat from fading. Airflow controls where heat travels and where it can't, and patience is worth more than firewood. In the language of the mountains, Elias had built cabin that didn't
A straight
panic
line
when
will
the
keep the
temperature
structure
dropped.
true.
It didn't spike hot and crash cold like every other shelter in Beaver Bend. It held steady. It breathed slow. It remembered warmth. In today's world, his ideas echo through concepts like passive house, super insulated buildings that need almost no heating, double envelope homes, 2 walls, air gaps, thermal storage, earth and lime plasters, natural materials with enormous heat retention, mass walls used in cold regions across Europe and the American Northeast. These modern systems cost
You
more
can feel how
time, more
solid it
planning,
is.
more thought.
Ooh, that's pretty good.
And they pay you back for decades, just like Crowe's did. The lesson is simple but rarely followed. Build smart once or struggle every day after. On the frontier, wood was the cost of survival. In the modern world, it's energy, money, comfort yet. Principle
be
is
ready
the same.
next
The
winter.
cold doesn't care how busy
be
you
ready
are or how
next
quickly
winter.
you throw a house together. Winter respects preparation, nothing else. Elias Crowe's cabin wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was a reward for understanding what most men ignored. His walls were conversation with heat, quiet pact. Stay here, don't wander, this place is home. In the mountain, winter, harsh and unforgiving, found itself outmatched by one man who didn't fight like the others, but thought like no one else. The cabin stood longer than anyone expected, long after the men of Beaver Bend drifted away, some to settlements, some to gold fields, some to graves no map ever marked. Elias Crowe's cabin remained resting quietly at the base of the slope where he had built it with his bare hands. Snow buried it, summer freed it years, weathered it, still held. By the time it finally fell, nearly 40 years after that brutal winter, the walls didn't crumble so much. Open like an old book revealing pages few had ever read. The clay tiles were still firm, the charcoal moss pats still springy. The air channels, those tiny tubes Elias had shaped with his thumbs, still perfect in form. Even in ruin, the structure looked as if it were waiting for someone to understand it again, but no one did. The men who
Thank
knew
you.
the story were long gone. The children who had seen
Thank
strange
you.
walls world themselves in the land had moved on. A rancher who cleared the site in 1880 said only, damn thing was warm inside, even in the shade. He didn't know why, he didn't know who built it. The name Crowe never crossed his mind, and that is how frontier knowledge dies, not in fire or flood, but in silence, not with denial, but with forgetting. Yet some truths linger even without storyteller. In the quiet of winter among the spruce and the drifting snow, you can almost imagine Elias Crowe sitting at the edge of his bunk, warming his hands on wall that refused to surrender its heat. You can imagine him at dusk, watching shadows settle across the valley, confident
Everything
his
holds what
home
we
would
put
stay
into it
warm long
if we
after
build
the
it
fire
right.
dimmed to coals. He believed something that most men didn't. You don't overpower winter, you outthink it, and he lived that belief in timber and clay and moss and patience and small cabin that stood long after its builder was gone. The frontier gave him no spotlight, history gave him no headline, but his work, quiet, stubborn, brilliant, proved timeless truth. Warmth belongs to the builder who prepares for it, not the man who chases it. And maybe that's
Crowe
the message
was
the
right.
mountains are trying to leave behind in a world that's always rushing, always forcing, always burning more than it needs. The smartest thing you can do is slow down, observe, listen, and build something that takes care of you long after your hands have stopped working. Sometimes the smallest, strangest idea, the one others call foolish, is the one that carries you through the hardest winter, just as it did for Elias Crowe.